On May 25, 2023, a man named Emilio Ghanem walked into a Starbucks on Redlands Boulevard in Southern California and ordered a coffee. He was 40 years old, back in town on business. He walked out to a rented white Nissan Frontier pickup, a truck that wasn't even his, and drove off into an ordinary Sunday afternoon. No one who knew him ever saw him again. 2 years later, investigators found what was left of that truck out in the Mojave Desert. It had been burned down to the frame, reduced deliberately to bare steel and ash, in a stretch of open desert, far enough from anything that whoever left it there could count on the heat and the distance and 2 years of nobody looking. Redlands police said the vehicle showed evidence of a homicide. They did not say what that evidence was. They still have not. Emilio Ghanem's body has never been found. Somebody tried to make a man disappear completely, and very nearly did. This is the story of who he was running from, and of the much older thing they were hiding, that his disappearance is what finally dragged into the light. Ghanem was not a stranger to the people who allegedly killed him. For years he had been inside their world. He belonged to a religious group called Way Spirit Led Assemblies, spread across Hemet and Colton, out in the hot, dry sprawl of California's Inland Empire. He worked for the group's own pest control company, once called Full Shield, later renamed MaxGuard, owned by the group's leaders. And then he did the one thing this story keeps turning on. He got out. He moved to Nashville, 2,000 miles away, and started his own pest control business in direct competition with theirs. In May 2023, he came back to Southern California, according to investigators, to build up new clients on the old ground. Weeks later, he was gone. Hold on to that word, out. A man who left, because leaving is the thread that runs through everything that follows. For a while, Ghanem's disappearance was just that, a missing man, a cold trail, a burned truck in the desert with no body attached to it. Then, before dawn on August 16, 2025, the investigation arrived at a gate. Agents with the FBI and Redlands police came up a remote road in Hemet near the foot of the San Jacinto Mountains to a compound ringed with fencing and no trespassing signs. They announced themselves. Nobody came out. The members inside stayed behind the gate, and the gate stayed shut for hours. In the end, authorities brought up an armored vehicle, the kind built for exactly this, and drove it through the fence. Neighbors watched from the road as the metal came down. When it was over, 2 men were in custody on firearms charges. Nobody was charged with murder that day. But for the first time, investigators were inside the walls, and they had started to understand that whatever had happened to Emilio Ghanem, the answer lived behind that fence. So who were the people behind it? The group was led by a woman named Shelley Martin, known to her followers as the prophetess, and her husband, Darryl Martin, described as its pastor. Prosecutors would later call the organization a religious high control group. Former members reached for a harder word. Authorities have been careful to say cult-like rather than settle the question outright, and no court has settled it either. Here's the shape of it, according to people who lived inside. A former member, speaking to reporters, said Shelley Martin claimed that God spoke through her directly, not inspired her, not guided her thinking, but spoke through her, the way a vessel carries a voice that is not its own. Another former member, a man named Anthony Duran, who says he left in 2019, described a climate of fear around the Martins. If you messed with the pastors, he said, your whole life would be over. And it could be, because the group's own pest control company was where the members worked, which meant income, housing, and belief were all folded into the same relationship. Leaving the belief meant leaving your job and your home in the same motion. Inside a world built like that, a person does not simply disagree with the woman whose voice is said to be God's. There is nowhere to disagree from. Keep that in mind, because it is about to matter in a way nobody expected, including the investigators standing inside that compound. Because as detectives pulled the group apart, looking for what happened to a grown man in 2023, former members started talking. And one of the things they talked about had happened 15 years earlier to someone who never had the chance to leave anything at all. According to a Colton police sergeant who spoke to the Los Angeles Times, detectives working an old closed case began receiving new information from former His Way members, people who, in the sergeant's words, had been reluctant to speak truthfully years before. The newer disappearance is what loosened the older silence, not the other way around. The old case went back to January 16, 2010, and to a 4-year-old boy named Timothy Thomas. His parents had placed him in the temporary care of Shelley and Darryl Martin at a home in Colton where members of the group lived together. Sometime in those days, Timothy got sick. What he had, the record would later establish, was a ruptured appendix. It is worth being plain about what that is, because the plainness is the whole horror. An inflamed appendix is one of the most ordinary emergencies in all of medicine and one of the most survivable. Caught in time, it is a routine operation, and a child is home in a day or two. It is not exotic. It is not mysterious. It is a phone call and a short surgery. Left alone, though, it does not resolve. The appendix bursts and infection spreads through the body over a period of days, and a small child runs out of time slowly, in pain, while the thing killing him is the most fixable it will ever be. According to reporting on the case, across those days, in a house full of grown adults, the household prayed over him instead of calling a doctor. He was eventually found unresponsive and died within the hour. The death was ruled natural. Police suspected neglect. No charges were filed. The file closed, and it stayed closed for 15 years. A 4-year-old died of something a doctor fixes in an afternoon because the adults in the room decided prayer was the answer, and no one picked up a phone. That is the darkest thing in this entire case, and there is no crime scene to it, no weapon, nothing to circle in red, just a child, and days, and a silence where a phone call should have been. And that is the turn this whole story rests on. The man burned in the desert was not this group's first death. He was the one that finally forced someone to look at the first. Once investigators were looking, the pattern did not stop at 2. There is a third name that sits at the edge of this story, Ruben Moreno, last seen at a home shared by group members in December 2017. His family did not report him missing until 2019, the delay itself saying something about how hard it was for anyone close to the group to come forward. His case is being investigated separately. No one has been charged in it. But investigators place him in the same orbit, 3 grown men and 1 small child, connected to the same group. And a shape starts to emerge from it that is worse than any single death. Inside the belief, a child dies, and it is written down as natural. Outside it, the people who leave tend to disappear. On December 11, 2025, a joint operation involving Redlands Police, Colton Police, the California Department of Justice, the Riverside County Sheriff's Office, and the San Bernardino County District Attorney's Office moved on the group's leaders and members across Hemet and Colton. Multiple people were taken into custody. Shelley Martin, according to police, suffered a medical event during or shortly after her arrest and was hospitalized. 4 days later, District Attorney Jason Anderson announced murder charges. Shelley Martin was charged in both deaths, Ghanem's and Timothy's. Her husband Darryl Martin was also charged, though the reporting has never been fully consistent about the scope of his charges. Later court reporting describes him charged in both deaths, while the earliest wire reports limited his charges to the boy's death alone. The public record never cleanly resolved that, so the honest position is the narrow one. Darryl Martin is charged in Timothy's death, and possibly in Ghanem's as well. What is not in dispute, Andre Thomas, Timothy's own father, was separately charged with murder in his son's death. Rudy Moreno was charged with murder and conspiracy in Ghanem's killing, and a 5th person, Ramon Duran, was arrested the following month in Nashville, the same city Ghanem had fled to, and extradited to California to face the same charges. What prosecutors believe drove the 2 killings could not be further apart. For the child, the theory is neglect inside a system of belief. For Ghanem, the word the prosecution reached for was simpler and colder. Greed. A man who had worked for the company, left, and come back to compete for its clients. The same leaders, allegedly. 1 death out of belief, one out of money, 15 years apart, tied to the same two names. The district attorney called it two separate, very winding roads that were finally starting to meet. Redlands Police Chief Rachel Tolber described what her investigators were up against more plainly, calling the secretive and manipulative actions of the group a particular challenge for her department. On February 5, 2026, the defendants appeared together at a preliminary hearing at the San Bernardino Justice Center. Prosecutor Justin Crocker laid out the state's account of Timothy's final days, arguing that the boy had shown obvious signs of serious illness and that the adults responsible for him failed to get him care. The defendant's attorneys declined to comment publicly. Shelley Martin, Darryl Martin, Rudy Moreno, Andre Thomas, and Ramon Duran all pleaded not guilty. A judge found sufficient evidence for the case to proceed to trial. As of the most recent public record, no trial date had been set. So here's where it stands. Not a conviction, not a confession, a set of murder charges, a set of not guilty pleas, and a judge's finding that there is enough here to put in front of a jury. Everything else, the compound, the company, the claim that God spoke through one woman inside it, remains testimony, allegation, and the accounts of people who got out. What is confirmed is this: a boy died in a house full of believers in 2010, and it was ruled natural, and nobody was charged. A man who used to believe the same things left in 2023, and within weeks, his truck was ash in the desert with no body inside it. It took the second death to reopen the first. What was reported, and only reported, is the thread that ties them. Former members describing a woman who told her followers that God spoke through her, and a household built so tightly around that claim that there was no safe way to question it and no clean way to leave. And what remains unresolved is not whether the Martins are guilty. A jury will decide that on whatever date gets set. What no verdict will settle is the thing this case keeps circling. If a woman really did convince an entire household that her voice and God's were the same voice, then the child who could not leave that house died slowly of something a phone call would have fixed. And the men who did leave were never seen again. The court can tell you what the state alleges happened in that house in Colton and in that stretch of desert. It cannot tell you what it was like to live inside a belief you were not allowed to question in the 15 years between one death and the other, while everyone around you kept calling it faith. Somewhere in an evidence locker in San Bernardino County, there's a burned truck frame that will likely become an exhibit. Somewhere in a case file that stayed shut for 15 years, there's a photograph of a 4-year-old boy who never got to grow past that age. Both belong to the same story now, same office, same two names. What connects them is not yet a verdict. For now, it is only a sentence repeated by more than one person who used to live inside that group, that there was a woman who said God spoke through her and never explained what happened to the people standing closest when he supposedly did.